Next, allegations of CIA drug trafficking. Monday, the House Select Committee on Intelligence heard testimony concerning a report alleging the agency's involvement in trafficking cocaine to the Los Angeles area.
Investigative reporting is being sort of squeezed out of the picture, and I think intentionally, because it tends to ruffle feathers. I mean, good investigative reporting does ruffle feathers, and it draws lawsuits, and it gets newspapers in trouble.
Imagine a world where the very institutions sworn to protect us are entangled in a web of deceit, drugs, and destruction.
Too was deeply disturbed by the allegations, as reported in the San Jose Mercury News in August of 1996, of the Central Intelligence Agency's involvement in the introduction, financing, and distribution of crack cocaine in the 1980s. Consequently, I contacted administration officials, the appropriate leaders of the House of Representatives, and even the former UN Secretary General to ask their respective organizations to look into these allegations. South Central Los Angeles and urban America. The first town hall meeting at Compton Community College on October 19, 1996, was attended by hundreds of residents from my drug-ravaged community. The purpose of the Compton Congressional Inquiry was to educate myself and other members of Congress about the specific issues raised by allegations of U.S. government involvement in and knowledge of drug trafficking in South Central Los Angeles. I also sought out how the local community responded to the widespread harm caused by the scourge of substance abuse, regardless of the source or cause, and allowed them to seek answers to these allegations. I invited the Justice Inspector General Michael Bromwich to come and meet with leaders and members of the community so that they could express their concerns. Mr. Bromwich observed the proceedings of the Congressional Inquiry and took notes with a number of panelists testifying, including Ricky Ross' mother and Ricky Ross himself, via telephone from the San Jose Detention Center. On November 15th, in response to my invitation, then Director of Central Intelligence, John Dortch, made an unprecedented visit to Allen Locke High School in the Watts section of my district to directly address the concerns raised by my constituents and me, generated by these allegations during a public town hall meeting.
Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel here. It's me here, Comrade Lavender here, and today I'm back with another anti-capitalism deep dive true crime YouTube video topic. Today I want to do the topic of Gary Webb and the CIA and the United States government's role in the drug trade, deep dive, capitalism, and true crime. I want to make this video because I've talked a little bit about the drug trade on my channel, but I haven't talked about Gary Webb's situation or any of that. I wanted to do that. So before we get started, all my YouTube videos will be on the screen right now. They're related to this topic in this YouTube video right now. My other YouTube videos, topics that I've done, and other, topics that I've done that relate to this topic will be on the screen right now if you'd like to check out my other YouTube video topics. So let's get started on this YouTube video topic. 18 years after it was published, Dark Alliance, the San Jose Mercury News bombshell investigation into the links between the cocaine trade, Nicaragua's Contra rebels, and African-American neighborhoods in California. Gary Webb wrote about the CIA cocaine connection during the U.S. government's dirty coups and wars in Central America in the 1980s. Remains one of the most explosive and controversial exposés in American journalism. The 20,000-word journalism series enraged black communities in America, and rightfully so. It prompted congressional hearings and became one of the first major national security stories in history to blow up online. It also sparked an aggressive backlash from the nation's most powerful capitalist big media outlets, which devoted considerable resources and time to discredit and blacklist Arthur Gary Webb's reporting. Their efforts succeeded, costing Gary Webb his career and job in journalism. On December 10, 2004, the journalist was found unalived in his apartment, having ended his 8-year downfall with 2 caliber bullets to the head, speculating that he could have been taken out for being a whistleblower by the CIA. Gary Webb's troubles began in August 1996 when his employer, the San Jose Mercury News, published a groundbreaking report, a 3-part investigation he had worked on for more than a year. Carrying the full title Dark Alliance, the story behind the crack explosion, Gary Webb's series reported that in addition to waging a proxy war for U.S. government against Nicaragua's revolutionary government in the 1980s, elements of the CIA-backed Contra rebels were also involved in trafficking drugs and cocaine into the United States in order to fund their counter-revolutionary campaign. The secret flow of drugs and money, Gary Webb reported, had a direct link to the subsequent explosion of the crack cocaine abuse that had devastated California's most vulnerable African-American neighborhoods. Gary Webb's series spread through extensive talk radio coverage and global accountability via the internet, which at the time was still a novel way to promote national news. The Dark Alliance would eventually morph into a personal crisis for Gary Webb. It was initially a PR disaster for the CIA. In managing a nightmare, minced no words in describing the potentially devastating effect of the series on the agency's image. The charges could hardly be worse. A widely read newspaper series leads many Americans to believe the CIA is guilty of at least complicity, if not conspiracy, in the outbreak of the crack cocaine crisis in American cities. In more extreme versions of the story circulating on talk radio and the internet, the agency was instrument of a investigation are demanded and ignited. The Congress gets involved. Nevertheless, a special Senate subcommittee chaired by then John Kerry investigated the AP findings in 1989, released a over 1,000-page report on covert U.S. operations throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. It found considerable evidence that the Contras rebels were linked to running of drugs and guns, that the U.S. government knew about it. From the subcommittee report, on the basis of evidence, it is clear that the individuals who provided support for the rebels were involved in drug trafficking. The supply network of the Contras was used by drug trafficking organizations, and elements of the Contras themselves knowingly received financial and marital assistance from drug traffickers. In each case, one or another agency of the U.S. government had information regarding the involvement, either while it was occurring or immediately thereafter. Despite such damning assessments, the subcommittee report received attention from the country's major newspapers. 7 years later, Gary Webb would be the one to pick up the story. His articles distinguished himself from the AP reporting, in part by connecting the issue that seemed distant to many in the United States readers, drug trafficking in Central America, to a deeply felt domesticated story, the impact on crack cocaine in California's urban African-American communities. Dark Alliance focused on the lives of 3 men involved in shipping cocaine in the U.S. Ricky Freeway Ross, a legendary L.A. drug dealer, Oscar Bolaños Reyes, considered by the U.S. government to be Nicaragua's biggest cocaine dealer, living in the United States, a powerful Nicaraguan player who had allegedly recruited Blanton to sell drugs in support of the counter-revolution. The series examined the relationship between the men, their impact on the drug market in California and elsewhere, and the disproportionate sentencing of African Americans under crack cocaine laws. While its consent was not all new, the series marked the beginning of something that it was: the in-depth investigation published outside traditional mainstream media outlets and successfully promoted on the internet. More than a decade before Wikileaks, Gary Webb showcased the power and reach of online journalism. Newspapers like The Times and The Post seemed to spend far more time trying to poke holes in the series than in following up on the unreported scandal at its heart, the involvement of the U.S.-backed proxy forces in international drug trafficking. The Los Angeles Times was especially aggressive. Scooped up in its own backyard, the California paper assigned no fewer than 17 reporters to pick apart Gary Webb's reporting and journaling. While employees denied an outright effort to attack the Mercury News, one of the 17 referred to it as the Get Gary Webb team. Another said at the time, "We're going to take away that guy's pleasure." According to Corblon CJR piece. Within 2 months of publication of Dark Alliance, the LA Times devoted more words to dismantling its competitor's breakout hit than compromised the series itself. The CIA watched these developments closely, collaborating where it could with outlets who wanted to challenge Gary Webb's reporting. The document chronicles the shift in public opinion as it moved in favor of the CIA, a trend that began about a month and a half after the series was published. The CIA didn't really need to lift a finger to try to ruin Gary Webb's credibility and reputation. They just sat there and watched the journalists go to town after Gary like a bunch of piranhas. At least one journalist who helped lead the campaign to discredit Gary Webb feels remorse for what he did. As Shua reported for the LA Weekly in a 2013 radio interview, LA Times reporter Jesse Katz recalled the episode, saying, "As an LA Times reporter, we saw the series in the San Jose Mercury News and kind of wondered how legit it was, kind of put it under a microscope. And we did it in a way that most of us who are involved in it, I think, would look back on it and say that was overkill. We had this huge team of people at the LA Times and kind of piled onto one lone muckraker up in Northern California. Gary Webb's bosses at the Mercury News wilted under the immense pressure and disowned the Dark Alliance series. Gary Webb was effectively run out of mainstream journalism. He passed away in 2004. The U.S. government has always been willing to ally itself with figures ranging from unsavory to repulsive if it best serves the U.S. empire and U.S. interests. During the Second World War and after, for example, the U.S. arranged an alliance with La Cosa Nostra in Italy via the imprisoned mafia kingpin in the U.S. that gave the mob free range to operate criminal enterprises in return for its assistance in the war against Mussolini's fascist regime, and later against the communists and other left-wing forces that were poised to dominate post-war Italian politics. During the 1950s and 1960s, the CIA protected the Corsium mob and its famous French connection. That was a major source of heroin imported into the United States in 1979. The Nicaraguan Revolution overthrew the hated U.S.-backed dictator Anastasio Somoza. Among the motley assortment of reactionaries who fled Nicaragua for the United States was Oscar Danilo Blandón, a former bureaucrat in the Somoza regime and son of a wealthy slumlord and cattle rancher. Blandón ended up in California, where he worked as a car salesman while organizing with other right-wing exiles to support an armed insurgent against the widely popular Sandinistas. The dregs of the old regime were pretty unsuccessful at raising money needed for the guns and equipment until he changed jobs. Along with the protection of the CIA in their product into the United States, the Contras, Rebel's new business venture had another stroke of good fortune and good luck. Drug dealers in the United States had figured out how to make cocaine affordable by cooking expensive powder into small nuggets of crack cocaine, which offered a powerful high at a fraction of the price. Blandón started supplying Mentes cocaine to a dealer in Los Angeles named Ricky Ross, who was able to undersell the competition thanks to Bland's low prices and reputable supply. By 1984, Ross and the main distributor of crack cocaine in LA, selling it to the biggest dealers in town, including both the Crips gang and the Bloods gangs. Meanwhile, Blandón was grossing more than $100 million per year.
The Taliban finances much of its operations by selling opium, which is grown from poppies, which are right now being harvested. So here's the question: why are American troops now helping Afghan farmers grow that opium? Nick Schifrin reports from Afghanistan on a controversial new policy.
In western Kandahar, poppy farmers score, kill, harvest their crop, and the Americans do nothing to stop them. U.S. soldiers greet farmers.
Can you show me which poppy field is yours?
They commiserate with farmers having a bad harvest.
Tell them I'm very sorry for this field this year, and Hopefully there's a better harvest next year.
And in one case, they even paid a farmer $1,000 after U.S. and Afghan special forces burned his crop.
There's a stunning new report this morning claiming that the brother of Afghan President Hamid Karzai is on the CIA payroll. Senior White House correspondent Bill Plant has more on that this morning. Good morning, Bill.
Good morning to you, Harry. Ahmed Karzai has long been a kind of poster boy for corruption in Afghanistan. But now the New York Times is reporting that for much of the past 8 years, he's been on the CIA payroll getting money from the CIA. The U.S. has a prickly relationship with Afghanistan's President Karzai, but it has been openly critical of the president's brother, Ahmed Wali Karzai, long suspected of involvement in the country's booming illegal opium trade. The new report says the CIA pays Ahmed Karzai on a regular basis for a number of services, including helping to recruit a paramilitary force that operates at the CIA's direction.
The timing of this revelation couldn't have been worse, I think, for the Obama administration. It undercuts the legitimacy of any argument we were making about the corruption of the Karzai regime.
The report comes on the heels of a high-profile resignation. Matthew Ho was a Marine captain, then a civilian for the State Department in Afghanistan, and now he's the first U.S. official to resign in protest against the war.
Basically, I feel that our strategies in Afghanistan are not pursuing goals that are worthy of sacrificing our young men and women or spending the billions we're doing there.
As President Obama considers whether to add as many as 40,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan, Ho says the U.S. military presence is the problem.
The people we are fighting there are fighting us because we're occupying them, not for any ideological reasons.
Obaidullah carefully tends to his poppy crops. After all, they're his lifeline. He's a landmine victim in Helmand province, and with 13 children to feed, he's steeped in debt. He has already given away one 12-year-old daughter to settle alone. Obaidullah knows that growing poppy is illegal in Afghanistan, but he says he has very little choice. He can earn around $280 a kilo for dry opium. For the same amount of wheat, he'll earn less than 50 cents.
I have to grow opium because my kids are hungry. I'm in debt and I'll lose my field if I don't earn money.
Obaidullah thinks the men who buy his poppies make medicine. He doesn't know that these crops are responsible for heroin addiction across the world.
Geopolitics, profit, and poppies, how the CIA turned Afghanistan into a failed narco state. A 2000 ban on opium cultivation by the Taliban-led government led to an almost overnight drop to just 185 tons harvested the following year, as frightened farmers chose not to risk attracting their wrath. The Taliban had hoped that the eradication program would win favor in Washington and entice the United States to provide humanitarian aid, but unfortunately, history and other ideas. On September 11, 2001, the U.S. experienced a massive case of blowback as bin Laden's forces launched attacks on New York and Washington. The U.S. ignored the Taliban's offer to hand him over to a third party, instead of opting to invade the country less than a month after the planes hit the World Trade Center. U.S. troops were patrolling the fields of Afghanistan. The effect of occupation was to expand the drug protection and presented new proportions. By 2008, opium was responsible for well over half the country's gross domestic product. By comparison, even in Colombia's darkest days, cocaine only accounted for 3% of its GDP. Today, the United Nations estimates that around 6,300 tons of opium and rising is produced yearly, with 224,000 acres in an area almost the size of Rhode Island planted with poppy fields. NATO forces were more and less guarding poppy fields and production under the disguise of counterinsurgency. The logic was, if we don't want to take away the livelihoods of people, but in reality, what we were doing was pretending the wealth of our friends in power in Afghanistan. The heroin trade implicated virtually everyone in power, including Afghan President Hamid Karzai, brother Ahmad Wali, among the biggest and most notorious drug kingpins in the south of the country, a man widely understood to be the pay of the CIA. locals came up with ways of profiting, such as refraining from planting one area, collecting large sums of money from occupying forces, and using that cash to plant elsewhere, effectively getting paid to both the plant and not to plant. Even worse, local warlords and drug bosses would destroy their rivals' crops and collect money from the United States for doing so, leaving themselves both enriched and in a stronger position than before. Having gained NATO forces' favor, that booming opium production and the U.S. failure to curb it provided the bulk for the financing for the Taliban, who captured a significant but unknown share of local profits from drug trafficking, which they used to fund guerrilla operations for the past 20 years, becoming a demonstrative factor in U.S. defeat in Afghanistan. It is not particularly difficult to grow opium. Opium poppies flourish in warm and dry conditions away from the damp and the wind. Consequently, they've been found a fertile home across much of Central and Western Asia. Underneath the flowers, one can find a large seed pod. Farmers harvest these, draining them of a sap which dries into a resin. This is often transported out of the country through a so-called southern route via Pakistan, but as with any pipeline, much of the product is spilled along the way, causing an epidemic of drug addiction across the region. The effect of the Afghan population has been nothing short of a complete disaster. Between 2005 and 2015, the numbers of adult drug users jumped from 900,000 to 2.4 million, according to the United Nations, which estimates that 1 in 3 households are currently affected by drug addiction. Where Afghanistan also produces copious amounts of marijuana and methamphetamine, opioids are the drug of choice. Mostly the people, around 9% of the adult population, and a growing number of children addicted to them. Added to this has been a spike in HIV cases as users share needles. Professor Julian Marcelli, author of Cruel Harvest, U.S. Intervention in Afghanistan Drug Trade, told Mint Press News. The effects of the CIA operation to bleed the Soviets dry in Afghanistan has also produced a humanitarian crisis in neighboring Pakistan. As McCoy noted, in the late 1970s, Pakistan had barely any heroin addicts, but by 1985, Pakistani government statistics reported over 1.2 million, turning the two nations into the global epicenter for the drugs trade. Almost overnight, the problem has only grown since. A 2013 UN report estimated that almost 7 million Pakistanis use drugs, 4.2 million requiring urgent treatment for dependency issues. Nearly 2.5 million of these people were abusing heroin or other opioids. Around 700 people die every day from overdoses. The highest rate of dependency is unsurprisingly in provinces in the Afghan border, where heroin is manufactured on a micro level. Addiction tears families apart and ruins lives. On an international scale, the opium boom has placed an entire region under significant strain. Therefore, one consequence of the U.S. policy in the Middle East, from supporting jihadists to occupying nations, has been to unleash a worldwide opium addiction that has made a few people financially wealthy and destroyed the lives of tens of millions of others. The U.S. government has had a long history of directly involving itself in the worldwide narcotics trade. In Colombia, it worked with President Alvaro U-Tribe on a nationwide drug war, even as the U.S. documents identified U-Tribe as one of the nation's most important drug traffickers, an employee of the infamous Medellin cartel, a close personal friend of drugs kingpin Pablo Escobar. Profits from drug running, funded by Europe's election runs in 2002 and 2006. General Manuel Nicaragua was also a key ally in the U.S. for many years. The Panaman was one of the CIA payroll, despite Washington knowing he was involved in drug trafficking since at least 1972, when he became de facto dictator of Panama in 1984. Little changed, but the director of Drug Enforcement Agency initially praised him for his vigorous anti-drug trafficking policy. However, the United States decided to invade the country and coup it and capture Nicaragua, and they sentenced him to 40 years in federal prison for drug crimes, largely committed while he was still on the CIA's payroll. To this day, the U.S. government continues to support Honduran strongman Juan Orlando Hernandez, despite the president's well-established connections to the cocaine trade. Earlier this year, the U.S. court sentenced Hernandez's brother Tony to life in prison for international drug smuggling, while Juan himself was unindicted co-conspirator in the case. Nevertheless, President Hernandez has proven himself effective at suppressing the anti-imperialist left inside his country and cementing the U.S.-backed 2009 military coup, one reason he is unlikely to face charges in the near future. Going back, the British used his opium machine to subtly and economically conquer much of China. Britain's insatiable thirst for colonization and Chinese tea was beginning to bankrupt the country, as the Chinese would only accept gold and silver as payment. It therefore used the power of its navy force, China, to cede Hong Kong, from which Britain began flooding China with opium as it grew in its possessions in South Asia. The humanitarian impact of the Opium War was staggering. By 1880, the British were inundating China with over 6,500 tons of opium every year, equivalent to many billions of doses, causing massive and social economic delocation as China began to struggle and cope with a crippling empire-wide drug addiction. Today, many Chinese still refer to this era as a century of humiliation. That is why China has the death penalty for drug dealers nowadays. In India and Pakistan, too, the effect was no less dramatic as colonialists forced farmers into planting inevitable poppy fields and later tea rather than subsidized crops, causing waves of huge famines to occur, and frequently of which never have been seen before.